Hello, friends. We often think that history is written by great strategists and brilliant plans, but in reality, it is frequently shaped by mistakes, laziness, and sheer absurdity. You see, life is the best scriptwriter, sometimes with a rather peculiar sense of humor. Today, you will learn about the self-styled Lord Timothy Dexter, who, against all odds, amassed a fortune selling bed warmers in tropical regions and coal in mining towns. We will talk about the richest person in history, Mansa Musa, whose extraordinary generosity led to an economic catastrophe for an entire continent, and about how an ordinary Cambridge coffee pot became the world's first internet star simply because programmers were too lazy to get up from their chairs. Before we begin, in accordance with our good tradition, please hit like and drop a comment about which city you are tuning in from. For you, it's just a single click, but it's a tremendous help for us in promoting the video. So, pour your coffee and make yourselves comfortable. We are about to dive into these incredible stories. Let's go. Story number 1. The philosopher who sold coal to miners and cats to heaven. You know, there are times when you do something foolish and it turns into a disaster. Well, forget that. Today we will discuss a person whose folly was so monumental that the universe seemed to throw up its hands and decided, all right, let him be lucky. Let's travel back to the late 16th century in the state of Massachusetts. In the town of Newburyport lives one Timothy Dexter, a tanner, a man with an education level equivalent to 2 grades of Sunday school and ambitions of a Roman emperor. He married well, received some money, bought a mansion, and decided he was now a lord. The local elite, comprised entirely of stuffy gentlemen, didn't exactly warm up to him. Timothy was loud, uneducated, and eccentric, and they decided to play a cruel joke on him. They began giving him friendly business advice, hoping Dexter would go bankrupt and disappear from their midst. Imagine the scene. A group of wealthy merchants with serious faces tells Timothy, "Listen, buddy, bed warmers to the Caribbean are the next big thing. Warmers for the Caribbean. In the tropics, where the heat is so intense it could melt asphalt if there were any, it's like selling ice to Eskimos." But Timothy nodded, bought 40,000 pots with lids, exactly how the warmers looked, in which coal would be filled, and sent a ship south. The merchants rubbed their hands together in anticipation of the upstart's failure. But then the ship arrives in the islands, and what do you think happens? The captain, of course, was met with incredulous disbelief. "Warm beds? Are you out of your mind?" But then a local planter looked at the warmer and thoughtfully said, "Well, this is the perfect ladle for syrup." It turned out that the long handle and deep container were just what one needed for pouring boiling sugar. The entire shipment sold out in just a few days at an enormous markup. Timothy became even richer. The envious merchants ground their teeth. They said, "All right, send coal to Newcastle." This was an English idiom meaning a pointless action, as Newcastle was the heart of coal mining in England. Bringing coal there is like carrying coals to Newcastle. Timothy, unaware of idioms, chartered ships, filled them to the brim with coal, and sent them to England. The irony of fate reached new heights. Just as Dexter's ships arrived at the port of Newcastle, a massive miners' strike began. Production ground to a halt, and the city was left frozen. Dexter's coal became the town's only salvation and was sold for the price of gold. It seemed his luck was infinite. He was advised to gather all the stray cats in the city and send them to the islands. He followed through, capturing hundreds of cats. The city sighed in relief, finally free from the noise, while Dexter dispatched his fuzzy cargo. And once again, bingo! On the islands where the ship arrived, warehouses were plagued by a rat infestation. The cats were greeted as heroic liberators. Eventually, Timothy decided to become an author. He published a book titled Nonsense for the Wise, where he recounted his greatness. It contained not a single comma or period, just a stream of consciousness spanning 33 pages. When readers began to complain about the text being unreadable, Dexter, in the second edition, added an entire page filled solely with punctuation marks at the end of the book and wrote, "Season the text to taste." Timothy Dexter died fantastically wealthy, never realizing he was laughed at. Or perhaps he was laughing at everyone. After all, winners are never judged, especially when Lady Luck is on their side. By the way, friends, for the most curious, I left links to all the primary sources in the description. Take a look, and we will continue. Story number 2. The genius who read minds but couldn't count. Let us travel to Berlin at the beginning of the 20th century, a time of gas lamps, monocles, and the belief that science would soon explain everything. Picture this. In one of the cobbled courtyards, a crowd has gathered. People hold their breath. In the center stands a school blackboard, and before it, instead of a professor in glasses, there stands a horse. An ordinary Orlov trotter named Hans. Next to him is his owner, a former schoolteacher named Wilhelm von Osten. The teacher takes chalk and writes on the board, "What is the square root of 16?" Silence. Only the distant sound of a carriage can be heard. Hans raises a hoof. Tap, 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 tap. 4 times. The crowd erupts in applause. This was not a circus trick. Clever Hans, as he was dubbed by the newspapers, could add, subtract, multiply, divide, and even work with fractions. If you asked him, if the first Tuesday of the month falls on the 8th, what day will next Friday be? He would tap out the correct answer. He could distinguish colors, musical chord tones, and even spell out the names of those present. The whole world went mad. Were animals truly intelligent all this time, just hiding it? The most astonishing part was that von Osten was not a charlatan. He did not charge money for the performance. He genuinely believed he had taught his horse mathematics. Moreover, when someone asked his owner to step away or even leave the courtyard, Hans continued to correctly answer questions from total strangers. Skeptics were outraged. In 1904, a special commission was gathered to investigate Hans. It included the circus director, veterinarians, officers, and even the head of the Berlin Institute of Psychology. They examined everything. Secret signals? None. Hidden magnets? None. Food training? Also not applicable. Reluctantly, the commission released a report stating, "There is no trick. The horse truly thinks." It seemed like biology textbooks would need to be rewritten, but then a young psychologist named Oscar Funkst stepped onto the scene. He was meticulous and did not believe in miracles. Oscar noticed one peculiar detail. Hans could only respond to a question if the person asking already knew the correct answer. If someone was shown a card with a number on it, making sure the horse could not see it, and then asked what was written on it, Hans would begin to helplessly stamp his hoof endlessly. Funkst conducted an experiment that would go down in the annals of science. He put blinders on Hans so that he couldn't see the people, and the magic vanished. It turned out that Hans did not understand mathematics. He understood people. This horse was a brilliant observer. When a person was asked how much 2 plus 3 is, they would involuntarily tense up. They would lean slightly forward, anticipating the answer. Hans would start tapping. 1, 2, 3, 4. As the count approached the number 5, the tension in the person increased, and upon reaching 5, the person would subtly exhale, relax their shoulders, or slightly lift their head, pleased that their answer was correct. Hans picked up on these microscopic movements, unnoticed even by the individuals themselves, and immediately ceased tapping. He read body language with the precision of a lie detector. He calculated the answer by observing the creases in brows, the corners of lips, and the posture of the questioner. This revelation was disappointing for the audience, but a triumph for science. Hans turned out to be even smarter than they thought. He couldn't count, but he was exceptionally perceptive. So next time your dog or cat looks at you with an understanding gaze, don't hastily dismiss it as mere imagination. They might know more about you than you realize. Story number 3. The Waffle Revolution, or how a Syrian flatbread saved the coldest treat in the world. Have you ever wondered that great discoveries sometimes happen simply because someone ran out of dishes? Seriously, imagine, it's summer, it's hot, there are crowds of people, and complete chaos reigns. Let's travel back to 1904 in St. Louis, Missouri. There was a World's Fair taking place. It was grand. The scale was incredible. People came from all over the world to see new machines, electricity, and other technological wonders. But, to be honest, most of them just wanted something to drink and something tasty to eat. The heat was so intense that the air seemed sliceable. In one of the pavilions stood an ice cream vendor named Arnold Fornacho. His business was going extraordinarily well. The line stretched for hundreds of meters. Everyone wanted his cold treat. However, there was one problem, a minor technicality. Arnold served ice cream in small glass cups, and he had run out. Imagine his panic. People were standing with money, the ice cream was melting, but there was nowhere to put it. Dishwashers were struggling, and the small vases simply couldn't return clean in time. Arnold was already contemplating shutting down his shop and escaping from the enraged crowd. But wait, it wasn't quite that simple. Next to Arnold stood another vendor, a Syrian named Ernest Hamwi. He was selling zalabia, which are thin, crispy wafers resembling flatbreads. Here's the paradox. Ernest's business was going terribly. Who would want to eat a hot wafer in 40-degree heat? Nobody. He stood there, wistfully looking at his unclaimed mounds of dough. Ernest glanced at the sweating Arnold, while Arnold looked at the empty hands of the customers. Then a spark ignited. Ernest grabbed his hot wafer, rolled it into a cone with his hands, and extended it toward his neighbor. "Here," he said, "put your ice cream in here." It was a moment of triumph. The ice cream nestled perfectly into the crispy cone. It didn't melt in their hands. Instead, it soaked into the wafer. And most importantly, there was no need to wash any dishes. They could simply eat it. The crowd froze. One bite, then another. And then it took off. Within an hour, everyone at the exhibition was walking around with these edible cones. People were tossing their spoons aside. This was a true revolution. With no blueprints, no patents, two neighbors simply decided to help each other in a tough moment. By the end of the exhibition, several thousand of these cones had been sold. And that's how, thanks to a happy coincidence and the lack of clean dishes, we got the most popular dessert format in history. And you know what's the funniest part? Arnold and Ernest never could agree on who actually came up with it. But does it really matter to us? The main thing is that we now have a waffle cone. So, do you taste that crunchy bite? This is just the beginning, because sometimes, to change the world, you just need to roll the dough at the right moment. Now, on to story number 4. The Iron Riders Who Traded Horses for Spokes. Have you ever tried riding a bike through mud? Not the kind you find in a park after a light rain, but the real sticky sludge that can suck your wheels up to the hubs. Now, imagine your bike has no gears at all. It's a heavy steel frame weighing about 40 pounds, and behind you, you have just as much gear. Picture that? Well, welcome to the year 1897. Back then, the world was going wild over bicycles. It was a craze rivaling today's interest in neural networks. But military personnel are conservative. They believed in horses. Horses were reliable. Horses were tradition. Yet one young lieutenant named James Moss thought it was time to shake things up a bit. He proposed a radical idea to create a bicycle corps. Why feed a horse when you can just pedal? So, 25 soldiers from the 25th Infantry Regiment of Montana lined up at the starting line. Look at them. They were strong guys. They earned the nickname Iron Riders. But it wasn't just they that were iron. Their bikes were too. No shock absorbers, no inflatable tires as we know them today. Narrow seats that make you want to walk for the rest of your life after just an hour of riding. Their mission was to travel from Fort Missoula to St. Louis. It's nearly 3,000 kilometers, through mountains, across sand, and over rivers where bridges were nowhere to be found. To be honest, even now, in a modern off-roader, this journey seems like an adventure. Just picture it. The road is merely a direction, littered with sharp stones and thorns. They set off in June, and the fun began almost immediately. The rains turned the paths into sticky mud. The soldiers weren't riding their bicycles, they were carrying them. Step by step, mile by mile. With 40 pounds of steel on their backs, rifles slung over their shoulders, along with food and tents. Then came the heat. Water was scarce in those regions. Occasionally, They had to drink from rotting puddles, filtering the liquid through cloths. Yet they didn't stop. Do you know what's the most astonishing thing? Their rhythm. They rode for 10 to 12 hours a day, even as the wheels broke, which they did constantly. Repairs were made right in the field, on their knees. Spokes snapped, chains broke, tires became rags, but Lieutenant Moss kept pushing them forward. Interestingly, when they passed through small towns, locals would rush into the streets. They had never seen anything like it. 25 individuals on strange iron contraptions, dusty and worn, yet moving with alarming precision. It resembled an alien invasion. After 41 days, they arrived in St. Louis. Dirty and emaciated, but they had done it. They had outpaced the cavalry on those same stretches of road. It turned out that bicycles didn't require oats, didn't get sick, and didn't need to be tied up at night. Moss was ecstatic. He had proven his point. However, hold on, it didn't end as he had hoped. The military leadership reviewed the reports, scratched their heads and said, "Impressive, but let's stick with horses. They're just more familiar." The project was shut down, and the bicycles were put into storage. Nevertheless, this expedition remains a remarkable example of human endurance in history. Without a single motor, without a navigator, simply propelled by will and steel pedals. When you look at their photographs, it's clear these people were forged from the same metal as their frames. So, how about that for a ride? After this, any commute to work seems like a breeze, right? And in our archives, there are stories about those who tackled challenges in even more elegant ways. Story number 5, the man who hugged a dinosaur. So, do you believe in friendship? Not the kind where you simply go to the movies together or grab coffee on Saturdays. I'm talking about a bond that defies all laws of nature, a friendship that makes biologists scratch their heads and say, that can't be possible. Imagine the jungles of Costa Rica, 1989, along the banks of the Ipacara River. A local fisherman named Gilberto Achadem, known to everyone as Cheetah, was walking along the shore when he stumbled upon, let's say, a massive problem. There lay a 5-meter crocodile, enormous, 450 kilograms of scales, teeth, and primitive fury. Yet there was no fury at all. The reptile was incredibly weak, barely breathing. Anyone else in Cheetah's place would have fled so fast that their heels would have sparkled, or perhaps called someone with a gun. But Cheetah was different. He gazed into that yellow eye and saw not a predator, but a living creature in distress, compelling him to intervene. I know, it sounds like nonsense. Picture him hauling this giant into a boat, transporting it back home. Cheetah housed the crocodile in the pond adjacent to his residence, naming it Pocho, and thus began the most peculiar chapter. Cheetah fed it fish and chicken, sleeping beside it on the sand. His wife, by the way, wasn't thrilled. I mean, you get it, right, dear? I brought home a 5-meter dinosaur. He'll live in our garden. Pure surrealism. After 6 months, Pocho grew stronger. He transformed back into the formidable hunting machine. Cheetah decided it was time to say goodbye. He took the crocodile to the river, released it, and said, "Live on, buddy. Be free." He turned around and walked home. And now a pause. Silence. The next morning, Cheetah stepped onto the porch, stretched, glanced at the pond, and saw Pocho lying there. He had swum several miles behind the boat, climbed ashore, and returned to him. He simply didn't want to leave. And so it continued for 2 decades. 20 years. They became a legend. Imagine the scene. Cheetah leaps into the water, and instead of lunging to bite his leg, the massive crocodile starts to play. Pocho swirled around him, snapped his jaws shut when Cheetah swam too close, and allowed the man to embrace him around the neck. Scholars from all over the world traveled to Costa Rica. They watched this and said, "This is impossible." Reptiles' brains aren't designed for attachment. It's simply a hunger instinct. But Cheetah just laughed. He would say, "If I call him by name, he'll come. If I want to play, he'll play." Pocho even learned a few commands. He resembled a huge, very toothy dog. When Cheetah splashed the water, Pocho would swim across the pond, presenting his head for petting. It was genuinely beautiful. Two beings from entirely different worlds found a way to communicate without words or training, merely based on the trust that began with one good deed by the riverbank. Their friendship lasted until the very end of Pocho's life. It was the longest and most astonishing bond between a person and a predator the world had ever witnessed. So how does that level of trust strike you? Sometimes it feels like we know everything about nature. Then along comes a fisherman from Costa Rica and flips it all upside down. Speaking of people who can achieve the impossible, there's a story about a guy who decided that the sky was not the limit, even if he only had a string in his hands. Story number 6. The house that grew from a single paperclip. So, what do you have on your desk right now, other than your phone or a cup of tea? Maybe some small item, an old coin, a pen cap, or an ordinary paperclip? Red, tiny, completely useless unless you need to clip a couple of sheets of paper together. We often think that major accomplishments require vast resources, connections, or at least a world domination plan. But sometimes, all it takes is the internet and an enormous amount of optimism. Let's travel back to 2005, Montreal. A young man named Kyle McDonald sits in front of his computer. He is unemployed. Well, to be precise, he does have a side job, but it's clearly not enough for the dream home. Before him lies a red paperclip, and suddenly a wild idea, the kind that usually vanishes 5 minutes after waking up, strikes him. He decides to test a theory of bartering. Can he exchange one small item for something larger, then trade that for something even bigger, and so on infinitely? Kyle browses a classifieds website. He posts, "I have a red paperclip. I want to trade it for something else. I don't care what." Do you think people laughed at him? Of course they did. But just a couple of days later, 2 women from Vancouver offered to trade. The paperclip was gone. In return, Kyle received a wooden fish-shaped pen. Well, that's progress, wouldn't you agree? A fish is certainly more substantial than a piece of wire. But then things took a surreal turn. On the very same day, he traded the pen for a handmade doorknob shaped like a funny face. Then he traveled to another state and swapped that face for a camping stove. You see the rhythm here? Paperclip, pen, stove? Friends shook their heads in disbelief. Parents questioned when he would get a real job. But Kyle had entered a state of excitement. He felt that the world around him was a massive warehouse of items that were useless to some, but treasures for others. He exchanged the stove for an old generator, traded the generator for an empty beer keg and a neon sign. Honestly, it was a questionable deal, but Kyle needed to keep the momentum going. The keg was traded for a snowmobile, and that's where the real fun began. Soon, the newspapers started to write about him. Imagine, a guy from the internet who turned a paperclip into a snowmobile in just a few months. It was like magic. But Kyle didn't stop there. He traded the snowmobile for a 2-person trip to the Canadian town of Yak. The trip was exchanged for an old van. The van was then traded for a recording contract. Do you know what he did with the contract? He gave it to a budding singer in exchange for a year of free rent in a house in Phoenix. It seemed like the perfect solution for housing, but it was just a rental, and Kyle wanted ownership, so he took a risk. He traded the rental agreement for an evening with rock star Alice Cooper. One evening, a couple of hours of conversation. People cried out, "Kyle, you're crazy! You traded a roof over your head for an autograph." But he knew what he was doing. He exchanged an evening with Alice Cooper for a snow globe that read "Kiss." Yes, that very souvenir toy that you shake and it snows inside. It seemed like a complete failure, the collapse of the entire scheme. But then Hollywood actor Corbin Burnson entered the picture. It turned out he was a passionate collector of snow globes. He had thousands, but he didn't have this particular one. He offered Kyle a trade, the snow globe for a role in his new film, complete with payment, a contract, and all the details. And now for the final twist. A small town called Kipling in Saskatchewan decided they needed some fame. The town council offered Kyle a deal. They would give him a real 2-story house with a yard, renovated and fully his, in exchange for that acting role. so they could hold auditions among the town's residents. Kyle agreed. After 1 year and 14 deals, he stood on the threshold of his own home. His pocket no longer held a red paperclip, but he did have keys. And you know what's really amazing about this? He demonstrated that the worth of an object is not what's marked on a price tag. It correlates to how much spirit and adventure you're willing to invest into it. The world brims with opportunities if you're ready to start with something tiny. So, have you taken a fresh look at your desk? Sometimes a little detail can build an entire destiny. Speaking of details, we have a story in our archive about a man who decided that if he was going to create something great, it should be visible even from space. And no, it's not the Great Wall of China. This is story number 7, the concrete sea in a hotel garden, or how one man gifted a country its own essence. Have you ever felt such immense gratitude that you wanted to, I don't know, move mountains, or at least construct a small concrete one right in your garden? You see, we often express thanks, but the hero of this tale concluded that words were too cheap. He resolved to gift Scotland a 10,000-to-1 scale model of itself. Let's transport ourselves to the 70s of the last century. The county of Peeblesshire. On a grassy lawn behind the old Baronia Castle Hotel stands an elderly man with a stern expression. His name is Jan Tomaszek. He is a Polish veteran who found himself here in Scotland during World War II while his homeland was ablaze. The Scots welcomed him, warmed him, and offered him a home. Now, 30 years later, having become a successful hotelier, Jan decided it was time to repay his debts. Imagine this ambitious project. It wasn't merely a papier-mâché model at a school exhibition. It was a colossal, three-dimensional map of the country, 50 meters long and 40 meters wide, the largest in the world. I hired a group of cartographer students from Krakow. They arrived for the summer, armed with theodolites, blueprints, and immense patience. Picture the rhythm of their work. Day after day, they laid out the contours of the coastline, pouring tons of concrete. They constructed every mountain, every valley. Ben Nevis, the tallest peak in Scotland, was represented as the size of a large dog. And here's where it gets really fascinating. Jan wanted the map to be alive. He installed a complex system of pipes throughout the area. When he turned a valve, water from the local stream would flow into the sea surrounding the map. Real water. It filled the depressions, simulating the tides. Loch Ness became alive with moisture. All the rivers started to flow. This was Scotland in miniature, encircled by a genuine ocean where one could stroll in rubber boots. You know what's most touching? Jan was not doing this for tourists. He was doing it so that his compatriots, the Polish soldiers who once patrolled these shores, could come here and view the entire country in one glance, as if they were gods. But wait, years passed, Jan passed away, ownership of the hotel changed, and the map, well, you can guess, nature isn't fond of concrete. Bushes began to grow through the mountains, ice shattered the valleys. The great Polish map of Scotland turned into ruins, concealed beneath a layer of turf and moss. For decades, it was forgotten. People walked over it, unaware that beneath their feet lay a lost world. It wasn't until the early 2000s that a group of enthusiasts happened upon strange concrete protrusions in the forest. They began to excavate. At first, the peak of a mountain emerged, then the outline of the Isle of Skye. It resembled an archaeological dig of Atlantis, yet it was nestled in the Scottish wilderness. Today, this map is a monument. It has been restored. It appears majestic once more. And when you stand at the edge of this concrete sea, you feel it's something special. That one individual, armed with concrete and a love for foreign lands, can leave a mark that even time will not erase. Truly impressive in scale. Thank you. Sometimes it seems that gratitude is fleeting, until you discover a 50-meter monument hidden in the bushes. Speaking of things concealed from sight, our archives hold a tale about how a single miscalculation turned an ordinary subway trip into an unexpected journey. And no, it's not about missing your stop. This is story number 8, the golden god beneath a layer of cheap plaster. Have you ever found something genuinely valuable? Not like 10 rubles in an old jacket, but something that shifts your perspective of the world. Picture this. The year is 1955, Bangkok. The heat and humidity make clothes stick to your body within seconds. In one of the old abandoned monasteries stands a massive Buddha statue. Frankly, it looks quite pitiful, a chunk of gray plaster, dusty, unattractive, bulky. There's no aesthetic appeal. The monks decided to relocate it to another temple, the usual bureaucratic task. They called in a crane. The workers grumbled, given that the behemoth weighed several tons. They wrapped it in cables and began lifting. Then came the pause. Silence. The cable snapped. Imagine that sound, a heavy, dull thud. The statue crashes into the mud. The monks are horrified. The workers freeze. The plaster starts to crack. It was pouring rain, and one of the monks, disheartened by the mishap, approached to inspect the damage. He turned on his flashlight and shone it into one of the fissures, and stopped. Something gleamed within the gray concrete, bright, rich, that kind of shine that is unmistakable. He began carefully chipping away pieces of plaster. At first, a shoulder appeared, then a face. After several hours of labor, before them stood a Buddha made of pure gold, 5.5 tons of pure 18-karat gold, the largest golden statue in the world. It turned out that 300 years prior, when the country was on the brink of invasion, well, you get the idea, unexpected visitors and all, locals decided to protect their sacred object. Instead of burying it, they executed a stroke of genius. They covered it with a thick layer of plaster and broken glass, rendering it ugly and seemingly useless. And it worked. The invaders passed by without sparing a glance at this discarded piece of junk. But later, those who knew the secret simply couldn't pass it on. Time went by. Generations changed. Everyone got used to seeing it as merely an old plaster statue. She stood under the rain and the sun for hundreds of years, harboring treasures worth hundreds of millions of dollars within her. Do you know what the coolest part is? It's a metaphor for our lives. Sometimes, behind the most unremarkable plaster exterior, something incredibly valuable lies hidden. It just takes, sometimes it takes a rope to snap, you see, for us to discover what is inside. So, have you looked within yourself? Often, the greatest discoveries await us where we least expect to find them. By the way, speaking of things that transform, in our archive, there is a story about a man who decided that if he was going to change the world, he would do it with the most ordinary sound, but not the kind we hear with our ears. Story number 9. The car that forgot it needed a driver. Do you believe in magic? No, not the kind with rabbits, hats, and marked cards. I'm talking about the real magic of technology that makes people on the streets rub their eyes in disbelief and cross themselves. Picture this. 1925. New York, Broadway. Noon. The city is bustling. Yellow taxis, the clatter of streetcars, thousands of people in bowlers and long dresses, and suddenly the crowd freezes. In the midst of all this activity, a luxurious Chandler sedan is slowly gliding along, beautiful, shiny, enormous. But there's one tiny detail. There's no driver. I mean, the seat is completely empty, and the steering wheel is turning by itself. The car smoothly swerves to avoid a distracted pedestrian, slows down at a crossroad, and honks its horn. Beep, beep. Imagine the horror and amazement of those people. 1925. To them, it looked as if a ghost of a very polite chauffeur had taken possession of the automobile. But wait, it was much more intriguing than that. Following a few dozen meters behind was another vehicle. Inside was a man named Francis Scudina. No, not the great illusionist Houdini, even though the name is amusingly similar. Francis was an engineer specializing in radio technology. In his hands was a peculiar device with buttons and levers. It was the first ever radio-controlled driverless car in history. Listen, it sounds simple now with our Wi-Fi and satellites, but back then, the trunk of the Chandler was crammed with enormous valves, coils, and wires. Radio waves transmitted signals to tiny electric motors that yanked the brake levers, turned the steering wheel, and pressed the gas. Francie maneuvered his American wonder car through all of Manhattan. Thousands of people ran after it. Policemen whistled in confusion. The car traveled down Fifth Avenue, skillfully navigating the flow of traffic. It was a triumph. People shouted that the future had arrived, that soon nobody would need to steer at all. But, of course, there were some mishaps. At one point, radio interference, well, you know how that goes, intervened. The car suddenly decided it was time to turn the wrong way. It barely missed crashing into a shop window, but Francie managed to regain control just in time. Thankfully, no one was injured, except for a couple of frightened horses who seemed to think the world was coming to an end. Do you know what's the funniest part? After this remarkable ride, Francis proposed his invention to military and postal services, and what was their response? Too complicated, too expensive. Besides, why do we need a driverless car when we have so many unemployed drivers? The project was shelved, and the idea was forgotten for a decade. Fast forward nearly 100 years, and we are once again developing drones, thinking we're pioneers. But it all started with a shiny sedan on Broadway, simply aiming to prove that invisible waves could surpass human hands. So, do you feel the breath of the future from the past? Sometimes we believe we are at the forefront of progress, while in fact, we are merely catching up to the ideas of those who lived a century earlier. Speaking of things that seem impossible until they're accomplished, let me share a story about a man who thought he could deceive not only sight, but time itself. Story number 10. The Guiding Thread of Paper and Gears. Have you ever tried to navigate an unfamiliar city using a paper map? You know, the big one that is impossible to fold back along its old creases and constantly blocks your view of the windshield? Now, picture yourself driving a car. You're going at a decent speed, hands on the wheel, needing to figure out where to turn. Nowadays, we simply poke at our smartphone screens and listen to a pleasant voice saying, "Turn right in 200 meters." But now imagine, imagine the year 1932. No satellites, no internet. Even radios in cars were a luxury for the elite. Picture a strange automobile rolling along the dusty roads of Italy. Inside, there's a device on the dashboard that resembles a tiny TV from the future. This is the Auto Navigator, the world's first device that we would refer to as a GPS today. Honestly, when I first heard about it, I thought it was a joke. What kind of navigator could there be in the 30s? Yet the engineers of that time were incredibly ingenious. Look at this device. Inside are two rollers. A long, narrow strip of paper is stretched between them. A map is drawn on that strip. Here's where it gets really interesting. How to make the map move in sync with the car. It's brilliantly simple. The device was connected via a cable directly to the speedometer. Do you understand? You press on the gas, the wheels turn faster, the speedometer records the speed, the cable transmits rotation to the roller in the device, and the map, it starts to move. This was all the rage back then. You drive, and the map in front of you moves at the exact speed as you roll down the road. You always know where you are. Well, almost always. By the way, this system had one tiny issue, just a minor one. If you decided to veer off the main route, say to stop at a cozy cafe in a nearby village, the navigator would become useless. The map was linear, just one straight road. To continue your journey, you had to retrieve a new roll of paper with the correct route, remove the old one, and load the new one. It was quite the adventure. Inky fingers, tangled ribbon. Passing cyclists glance at you as if you're out of your mind. But do you know what's truly amazing about this? The rhythm of progress. People back then already grasped that one must know where they are heading. They didn't wait for someone to launch rockets into space. They took paper, glue, a couple of gears, and crafted the future with their own hands. The Iter Auto didn't become widespread. It was too expensive and incredibly complicated to prepare those paper reels for every road across the globe. The idea nestled away, lying dormant for a decade. Only by the end of the 20th century did it resurface, morphing into pixels on a screen. Yet every time your GPS recalculates a route, remember that somewhere back in the 30s, an invisible paper roll from a small Italian device is turning. So, can you feel how the gears of history drive our present days? Sometimes, taking a step back helps us realize just how far we've come. Speaking of journeys, our archives hold a tale about a very determined woman who decided that the best way to explore the world wasn't by car or train, but through, let's say, something entirely unconventional. Story number 11. A modesty that taught us to listen to our hearts through a paper tube. Have you ever felt genuinely awkward? You know, when your cheeks flush, words get tangled, and you just want to evaporate, blending into the decor? Typically, we try to forget such moments quickly. But imagine a doctor from Paris in 1816 who turned his shyness into something each of us has likely encountered at least once in life. Let's travel to dreary Paris, to the Neckar Hospital. A man named René Laennec walks through the corridors. He's an exceptional doctor, intelligent and meticulous, but frankly, he's remarkably shy, almost pathologically so. In those days, to listen to a patient's heartbeat, a doctor had to press his ear directly against their chest. You see, there were no intermediate devices, just the doctor, the patient, and a very intimate distance. This was known as direct auscultation. So, René invites a young woman in for an examination. She clearly has heart issues. She's of high society, dressed in a lavish gown, corset and all. At that moment, René finds himself in a quandary. He looks at her. She looks at him. He realizes that pressing his ear against the chest of this noble lady is simply, well, beyond his decorum. Impossible. The suspense in the room was palpable. Doctors, colleagues watch, relatives await, and René is blushing, unsure of what to do. And then, a pause. He remembers a simple thing. You've seen children playing in the yard, right? One presses his ear against a long log, and another scrapes at the other end. The sound amplifies. It's physics. René grabs a stack of paper lying on the table, a few sheets. He rolls them into a tight, sturdy tube and binds it with some ribbon. Everyone watches him as if he's lost his mind. He places one end of this paper contraption against the patient's chest and the other to his ear. And wonder of wonders, he not only hears her heart, he hears it as clearly as never before. Every valve, each beat. The sound was crystal clear. The paper tube acted as a perfect amplifier. That day, René not only salvaged his reputation as the modest one, but he also forever transformed medicine. You see, he was so inspired that he returned home and commenced experimenting. He carved tubes from wood made of ivory. He named his device a stethoscope, which translates from Greek to listener of the chest, though, to be honest, he didn't really inspect, he listened. Nevertheless, the name caught on. His peers initially laughed, saying, "René, why do you need that horn? We have ears." But when they realized that through this horn one could hear a disease in its early stages, the laughter ceased. Do you know what's most touching? René Laennec considered this invention to be his greatest pride until the end of his life. Not his scientific treatises or titles, but rather the ability to listen to life without disturbing another person's peace. Now, do you remember that cold metallic disc at the doctor's office? Now you know, it was born from simple human shyness and a rolled-up sheet of paper. Sometimes our weaknesses are exactly what the world needs for a significant breakthrough. Speaking of breakthroughs and those who see the world differently, there is a story about how an ordinary mail clerk decided that if he was going to send letters, they should reach the recipient, even if he is, let's say, quite far from where he is expected to be. Story number 12. The bed that salvaged a gentleman's reputation. Have you ever lived in a truly tiny apartment? You know, one where the bed takes up 90% of the space? When guests come over, they either have to sit on your blanket or stand in the doorway. Today we call it a studio and pay a fortune for it. But imagine the year 1890. San Francisco, the city of fogs, steep hills, and very strict rules of decorum. In one such cramped room lived a young man named William Lawrence Murphy. The guy was ambitious but not wealthy. His living situation was, let's say, Spartan. One room that served as a living room, dining room, and bedroom. And here we arrive at the main intrigue. You see, back then, the code of honor and etiquette rules were tougher than any criminal code. There was one ironclad rule. A gentleman could never, under any circumstances, invite a lady into his bedroom. This was considered the height of indecency, a scandal that would bring shame to the entire city. But if you only had one room and a massive, unmistakable bed stood in the middle, then your entire dwelling was automatically categorized as a bedroom. Do you grasp the drama? And William was in love, not just with anyone, but with a young opera singer. He desperately wanted to invite her for tea, discuss music, and generally show hospitality. But the bed, a cursed mountain of mattresses and pillows, stood between him and his happiness like an insurmountable wall. In that moment, hold on, William did not despair. He wasn't just a romantic, he was the son of a mechanic. He began to think, if I can't physically remove the bed from the room, I must make it disappear visually. A trick is needed. Magic. But without mirrors and rabbits, just loops, springs, and a good old wardrobe. Imagine this process. For countless nights, William was whittling, adjusting gears, and cursing the unyielding wood. He created a unique hinge mechanism. The idea was to allow the bed, along with all the mattresses, to lift vertically with just a simple movement and hide away in the closet. One moment and you have a bedroom. 2 moments and voila! An elegant living room without a hint of nocturnal slumber. Listen, when he first invited his singer, he was as nervous as if he were about to commit a crime. She entered. The room was empty and spacious. They enjoyed tea while discussing opera. William's reputation was in no danger. The bed quietly remained in the wardrobe, like a well-trained dog. Soon, William realized that his invention was needed by more than just lovesick paupers. Cities were expanding and apartments were getting smaller. In 1909, he patented his bed wardrobe. You know what's amusing? This invention became a symbol of an entire era. Murphy beds started being installed in hotels, aboard ships, and in urban high-rises. William became fantastically wealthy. He married that very opera singer. Yes, indeed, the trick with the wardrobe worked perfectly. But there was one side effect. Back then, mechanisms were a bit, shall we say, temperamental. In silent comedies of the early 20th century, the Murphy bed became a leading comedic character. It would always fold up at the most inconvenient moments, swallowing the protagonists along with their shoes. Audiences roared with laughter at seeing a man wrestling with his own furniture. Yet, despite all the jokes, William's bed has withstood the test of time. It is still with us today, and every time you see a bed that hides in the wall, remember, it's here not just for space saving, but for love. And one very determined guy from San Francisco who just wanted to enjoy tea with an opera singer while adhering to social conventions. Well, have you felt how sometimes everyday struggles push us towards great achievements? Sometimes it only takes one closed wardrobe door to open a door to a new life. Speaking of things that change their appearance, we have a story in our archives about how an ordinary piece of fabric, created for rough work, became the main symbol of freedom, making its journey from mines to global runways. And no, it's not what you might think at first. Story number 13. A small frozen cup that changed summer forever. So, have you ever forgotten something important outside? You know, just accidentally left it behind? We usually scold ourselves for such carelessness. Keys in the lock, a wallet on a bench. It's always stressful. But imagine, an 11-year-old boy from Oakland forgot a cup of soda on his porch, and his mistake ended up costing millions. Millions. And he just wanted a drink. Let's travel back to 1905, California. But, to be honest, it wasn't exactly a warm night there. A rare chill had settled over the city. You know, that biting frost that makes breath visible in the air. Little Frank Epperson was playing on the porch. He was trying to make himself a fizzy drink. You know how kids can be, mixing powder, water, and a stirring stick. He mixed it all up in a regular cup, took a couple of sips, and got distracted. Maybe his mom called him, or he spotted something interesting in the garden. In any case, the cup got left on the rail with the wooden stick inside. The night was long, cold, and silent. The next morning, Frank rushed outside. He remembered his drink, but instead of liquid, he found ice. The drink had frozen right around the stick. Frank, like any normal child, didn't think too long about it. He pulled on the stick, and voila! An icy cylinder popped out of the cup, bright and sweet, and it was incredibly easy to hold. Listen, this was a moment of revelation. Frank licked it and realized it was brilliant. He began making these things for his friends, and soon for the entire neighborhood. But you know how childhood is? Life, games, school. The story of the ice on a stick faded into the background. 18 years passed. 18. Frank grew up and became a man. Then, in 1923, he decided it was time to take action. He remembered that frosty evening in Oakland. Frank patented his invention, calling it Epsicle, a derivative of his last name and the word icicle. But then his children got involved. They constantly asked, "Dad, make your icicle." Well, Dad's icicle. In English, it sounded like popsicle. Frank listened and renamed the product to Popsicle. Do you know that name? The whole world knows it. It's a classic. The very fruity ice treat that we all love in July. By the way, when Frank first presented it at a firefighter's ball, people were simply amazed. They had never seen food that could be held by a stick without getting their hands messy. It was a sensational hit, pure delight. In the first year, he sold thousands of them. You know what's the most ironic part? Frank Epperson ultimately sold the brand rights to a major company because he simply needed the money. But his name will forever remain in history as the person who turned a childhood lapse into a symbol of summer joy. So, are you craving something cold? Sometimes it only takes one frosty morning and a forgotten cup to create a legend. Speaking of things that start small, we have a story in our archive about a man who decided he could build an entire empire using only what others threw away in the trash. And it wasn't just a business, it was genuine transformative magic. Story number 14. The coffee pot that became the first global movie star. So, what are you willing to do for a cup of coffee? You know, when the deadline is looming, your eyes are heavy, and your brain refuses to churn out even the simplest thought. We usually just get up and head to the kitchen. But imagine your kitchen is on another floor, at the other end of the building. And when you finally get there, after navigating a bunch of stairs and hallways, the coffee pot is empty, silent. Just a drop trickles down the glass. That's a tragedy, right? Pure disappointment. Let's rewind to 1991. England, the University of Cambridge, Computer Laboratory. During those times, the people working there were literally shaping our digital future. But even geniuses need coffee. There was just one coffee pot for everyone in the lab. It was located in a room called the coffee room, while the staff worked across different floors. Now, imagine this rhythm. A person stands up, walks across the entire building, ascends the stairs, opens the door, and finds it empty. This happened 10 times a day. Dozens of frustrated scientists, hundreds of wasted minutes. But these were programmers. They didn't start hanging schedules or complaining in chats, which were nearly non-existent back then. They decided to solve the problem in an elegant engineering way. One team member, Nefortfer, brought an old video camera from home. Another guy, Paul Jardetsky, wrote a program. They pointed the camera at the coffee pot. The camera snapped a picture once per second. Black and white, grainy, nowhere near Hollywood quality. But now every lab employee could open a small window on their computer and voila! In real time, they could see whether the coffee pot was full or empty. It was the world's first webcam, even though the term webcam hadn't even been invented yet. Now, here comes the strange part. 2 years passed. The first internet browsers emerged, and the scientists thought, why not broadcast the feed online, just for fun, to show colleagues from other countries how the tough British techies live? And the coffee pot from Cambridge instantly became a global sensation. Imagine people from Japan, America, and Australia visiting the site just to see a glass jug of brown liquid in an English university. 1 million people, tens of millions of views. The coffee pot was featured in the news, and it was written about in newspapers. It became a symbol of how the internet connects the world. People sent emails saying, "Oh, today the coffee looks stronger," or "Hey, someone, please fill it up already." The broadcast lasted for 10 years. 10! In 2001, they decided to ceremoniously shut it down. The laboratory was moving to a different building. This event was covered by all major global media. The last cup of coffee was consumed live, to the applause of viewers from around the planet. You know what's the funniest part? That legendary coffee pot was later auctioned off and sold for £3,350 sterling. It was purchased by a German magazine to display in their office, and of course, to start a new broadcast. This is how an ordinary coffee pot and the reluctance to walk up the stairs for nothing created a technology that we can't imagine our lives without today. Every time you make a video call, remember, it all began with a mundane coffee pot in Cambridge. So, have you brewed yourself a cup? Sometimes the greatest things arise from the simple desire to save a couple of steps. Speaking of things that begin with curiosity, we have a story in our archive about a little girl who found a treasure older than history itself, and she didn't even realize she was holding the key to the past. Story number 15. The girl who saw the ceiling of the world. Have you ever noticed that adults always tend to look down at their feet or straight ahead? We are constantly preoccupied with avoiding tripping, finding the right path, or simply not running into a pole. We search for answers on the ground. But children look everywhere. They lack our filters for what is important and what is not. Imagine, one such outing of a little girl changed everything we think about humanity forever. Everything. Let's travel back to 1879, Spain, in the province of Cantabria. It was summer outside, but it always feels cool in the mountains. There lived a gentleman named Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola. He was not a professional scientist, rather, let's say, an enthusiastic amateur. Professionally, a lawyer, but in his heart, a seeker of antiquities. He loved digging in the earth, searching for ancient bones or arrowheads. That day, he headed to the Altamira cave, a regular hole in a mountain discovered by shepherds several years earlier. Marcelino took his 8-year-old daughter Maria with him. You know, a little family outing. Dad digs in the dirt, while the daughter runs around nearby. Picture this scene. The cave is dark, damp, and it smells of stone and antiquity. Marcelino lit a dim oil lamp. He kneeled at the entrance to one of the chambers and began eagerly sifting through the soil. He was looking for traces of ancient human habitation, shards, deer teeth, and various small artifacts. His gaze was firmly fixed on the ground. He was convinced that everything significant lay hidden in the dust. Meanwhile, little Maria, well, she found it boring to watch her father dig. She took a candle and wandered deeper into the hall. The ceiling was low there. An adult would have to bend down, but for an 8-year-old girl, it was just right. She lifted her head. The candle's flame flickered, illuminating irregular projections of rock from the darkness, and suddenly, there was silence. Only the sound of a drop of water falling somewhere in the depths. "Dad," she cried, "look, bulls!" At first, Marcelino didn't even turn around. What bulls in a cave? My daughter is imagining things. But Maria persisted. She tugged at his sleeve. Reluctantly, Marcelino stood up, walked a few steps, bent down as much as he could, and raised his lamp to the ceiling, freezing in place. His heart likely skipped a beat. Above them, all along the cave's arch, were bison. Huge, powerful creatures. They were painted with ochre, charcoal, and something else that provided a stunning red hue. The ancient artist had brilliantly utilized the irregularities of the stone, the protrusions becoming the muscular sides of the animals, the cracks forming the curves of their backs. They looked alive. In the flickering light of the lamp, it seemed that they were breathing. It was breathtaking. Marcelino realized that these were not just drawings, they were masterpieces of the highest order. However, when he published his findings, the world responded with a cold shower. The scholars of that era simply laughed in his face. They said, "Listen, Marcelino, do you really take us for fools? Ancient people were savages. They could only bludgeon one another with clubs. They could not create such beauty. You simply hired an artist to paint all this and make yourself famous." He was accused of forgery. The greatest minds of that century labeled him a liar. Marcelina passed away without ever receiving recognition. You see, a person discovered a treasure, and for that, they were trampled. It was only after 20 years, when similar drawings were found in other caves in France and Spain, that the world gasped in astonishment. It turned out that Maria was right. These bison were older than 14,000 years. 14,000! It became evident that our ancestors were not just cavemen, they were artists, dreamers, and creators. Maria grew up and witnessed her father's triumph. She lived to see the day when the Altamira cave was dubbed the Sistine Chapel of Primitiveness. Do you know what's most significant about this? If, on that day, Marcelina had gone into the cave alone, he likely would have sat there all day staring at the floor. He wouldn't have even thought to raise his lamp above his head. Sometimes, we all need a little girl to tug at our sleeve and say, "Hey, look up. There's a whole world up there." So, when was the last time you gazed at clouds or stars? Sometimes, the truth is found in the most unexpected places. Speaking of things that are hidden right under our noses, we have a story in our archive about how a very peculiar discovery in an ordinary field led to the unveiling of a city once thought to be a legend. And this was no ordinary city. It was a genuine marvel of engineering, concealed beneath the roots of grass. This is story number 16. The village that taught the world to think 3 moves ahead. Have you ever felt that your city has its own, let's say, genetic code? A unique hobby that unites everyone, from infants to the elderly? We typically take pride in local football teams or some special kind of pastry. But imagine a place where your social status, education, and even your rights to marry once depended on how well you moved wooden pieces across a board. Let us travel to Germany, to the foothills of the Harz Mountains, to a village named Strobeck. At first glance, it appears to be a typical European settlement. Tidy houses, geraniums in the windows, church spires. But if you take a closer look at the details, it might make your head spin. The chessboard pattern is everywhere, on building facades, in the city coat of arms, even shaped by bushes in public gardens. And it all began, well, hold on. History tells us that it all started in the year 2011. 11 centuries ago, back in that distant time, a notable guest, Count Gundelin, was brought to the local tower, proudly known as the Prison Tower. He was not just a prisoner, he was a key player in grand politics. To prevent him from going mad out of boredom within those 4 walls, he started playing chess. But who could he play with? The guards. Simple village men who had previously only known the plow and shovel suddenly realized that the world was made up of 64 squares. The Count proved to be an excellent teacher. The guards went home and taught their children, who in turn taught their friends. This was like an intellectual virus that spread throughout the village. 100 years later, there wasn't a single person in Strobeck who didn't know how a knight moves or what castling is. But do you know what is most remarkable about this? The rhythm of their lives. In 1823, imagine, almost 200 years ago, chess was officially incorporated into the school curriculum like mathematics or penmanship. Every child in the village had to pass an exam on endgames in order to receive their certificate. By the way, they had one tradition that was quite astonishing. When a young man wished to marry a local girl, he had to play a game of chess against her father or even the mayor of the town. If the young man lost, well, let's just say the wedding could be postponed. It was a kind of test of intellect. Were you worthy enough to join our family of thinkers? By the end of the 19th century, when great grandmasters of the time arrived in Shrewsbury, they were utterly shocked. They would enter a regular tavern, sit down at a table with a simple farmer in a worn-out jacket, and lose. For that farmer, chess was not just a sport, but a breath of life, woven into the fabric of his daily existence. Do you know what's the kindest part of this? This tradition is still alive today. Every year, tournaments are held where children play live chess, dressing up as kings and pawns. It's not just about dry logic. It's about connections between generations, about how a small game, beginning in a rustic chamber, can transform an ordinary village into one of the smartest corners of the planet. So, do you feel like dusting off the old board? Sometimes, the quietest passions create the loudest fame. Speaking of things that require steely logic and incredible patience, we have a story in our archives about a man who decided he could deceive everyone using only silence. And he wasn't a magician, but a true spy whose main weapon was simple ink. Story number 17. A revolution born in a prison bowl. Have you ever pondered, while looking at your bathroom shelf, that the most ordinary item, the one that starts every morning for you, has a rather peculiar origin? We are accustomed to bright plastic handles, nylon bristles, and dentists' promises of a dazzling smile. But imagine a time when hygiene was, let's say, a matter of chance, and cleanliness came not from a laboratory, but from a cramped cell in a London prison. Let's transport ourselves to 1780, London, Newgate Prison. Honestly, it was a rather unpleasant place. Cold stones, dampness, and an abundance of free time for those locked inside. Among the prisoners was a man named William Addis. He was there for, well, let's say, his involvement in a riot. Back then, it was quite commonplace. Now imagine his daily routine. Morning, William wakes up. He wants to feel human, but the reality smells nothing like violets. In those days, people cleaned their teeth, if they even did, with a piece of rag dipped in salt or soot. Well, you understand. Rubbing dirt on teeth hoping it would get better. To William, this seemed wrong, dirty, ineffective. He looked at that rag and thought, there must be a better way. There just has to be. And then, a pause. The silence of the prison yard. During lunch, William saved a small bone. It seemed to be a shank from his meager meat ration. He traded some bristles from a guard. Wait, that's not exactly how it happened. Legend has it, he simply collected clumps of stiff hairs left on the floor after some hides had been dragged past. He took action. Lacking tools, he only had patience and a scrap of metal. He made tiny holes in a piece of bone. It was truly a delicate task for a person sitting in semi-darkness. He inserted the bristles into these little holes and secured them with glue, which, to be honest, can be found in the most unexpected places in prison if you know the right people to negotiate with. When he finished, he held the first prototype of a modern toothbrush. A bone handle, natural bristles, compact and comfortable. The other inmates probably looked at him like he was crazy. "William, what are you doing with that bone?" But when he was released, he didn't discard his creation. On the contrary, he realized he had stumbled upon a gold mine. Addis opened a small workshop. Initially, people were skeptical. Well, old habits die hard. But gradually, one gentleman tried it, then another, and word spread. Addis's toothbrush became a symbol of a new era. It was effective, it simply worked. William Addis became fabulously wealthy. His company, which he named Wisdom to Bruce's, still exists to this day. Can you imagine 300 years of history beginning with a single gnawed bone in a prison cell? You know what's most inspiring about this? William didn't complain about his fate. He didn't give up in prison. He simply decided that even in the darkest place, one could create something that would make the world a little cleaner. Literally. So take a look at your toothbrush tonight with new respect. Sometimes the most important things in our lives emerge from the least expected places. By the way, speaking of things that change our lives unnoticed, we have a story about how a small piece of paper with nothing written on it helped save thousands of people, simply passing from hand to hand in complete silence. Story number 18. The Queen of the Roads Who Traded Her Corset for a Wrench. Listen, have you ever set off on a journey knowing full well that the roads, well, they simply don't exist? No, I'm not talking about the potholes in the yard that we complain about every spring. I'm referring to thousands of miles of mud, sand, and uncertainty. Today, we can't reach the neighboring mall without a GPS gently warning us of every bump. Now, imagine it's 1909, the United States of America. Back then, a car was viewed as, let's say, a costly and temperamental toy for wealthy gentlemen. It was believed that a woman and a complex machine were utterly incompatible. At best, a lady was allowed to sit in the passenger seat and gracefully hold an umbrella. But then Alice Ramsey entered the scene. She was 22 years old. She adored speed, and was utterly fed up with being told, "You can't." Imagine that challenge. Alice decides to journey across the country, from New York to San Francisco, a distance of 3,800 miles. And this is where things get really interesting. Do you know how many miles of paved roads there were in the United States back then? 152. Everything else was just dirt paths from wagons, horse manure, and swamps where cars could sink up to their headlights. Listen, she didn't embark on this adventure alone. She brought along 3 friends, but none of them knew how to drive at all. Alice was the sole mechanic, driver, and navigator in this all-female crew. They didn't have maps. Well, maps as we think of them didn't exist. Do you know how they found their way? They had a guidebook that included directions like, "Pass the red barn, turn left at the fallen oak tree, and if you see a yellow fence, you've missed your turn." And off they went in a dark green open-top Max car, with no windshield and no roof. The pace of their journey was absolutely frantic. Rain turned the ground into a sticky muck. Alice spent hours digging through the mud, placing boards under the wheels. She changed the tires herself, which needed to be replaced 11 times. She cleaned the spark plugs while standing knee-deep in water. Once, the brake pedal broke, and Alice simply tied a rope to the lever and pulled it when she needed to stop. Pure engineering ingenuity. By the way, when they passed through small towns in the Midwest, people ran out into the streets. They had never seen a monster of a car, let alone 4 women inside it. Local newspapers wrote, "This is madness. They will perish in the prairies." But Alice just adjusted her pince-nez and pressed on the gas. One night, they had to sleep in a field because the car got stuck in a deep ditch. Another time, they encountered a gang of riders, but they turned out to be just curious cowboys wanting to see how the engine worked. After 59 days, they arrived in San Francisco. Dirty, exhausted, but utterly thrilled. Alice became the first woman in history to cross the continent behind the wheel. She proved that it's not about the terrain or the strength of your arms, it's about character. Do you know the most amazing part? Alice Ramsey drove until she was 94 years old. 94. She outlasted the era of horse-drawn carriages and saw humans land on the moon. Yet for her, the most significant experience remained that journey through mud and fog, where nothing lay ahead but the horizon. So, do you feel the taste of road dust on your lips? Sometimes, to find oneself, you simply need to drive as far from home as possible without having a map on hand. Speaking of long journeys and incredible patience, we have a story archived about a man who believed he could defeat time without moving an inch. His tool was a simple brush that created a masterpiece where no one was supposed to find it. This is story number 19, The King Who Was Too Rich for This Planet. By the way, have you ever pondered what true wealth really is? Not the kind where you can afford a new car or a vacation on an island. I am speaking of sums so vast that their mere existence could cripple the economy of an entire region for decades. Today, we follow the lists of the richest individuals in the world, but to be honest, all these modern billionaires are merely children compared to a man who lived 700 years ago. Let us travel back to the year 1324. Africa, the Mali Empire. On the throne sits a man named Mansa Musa. You know, during that time, Europe was choking under hunger, disease, and endless wars. Yet, in Mali, the situation was vastly different. There was gold, an astonishing, absurd amount of gold. It is said that half of the world's gold reserves at that time were sourced from there. Mansa Musa decided to embark on a pilgrimage, a journey from his city of Timbuktu to the holy Mecca. But it was far from an ordinary trip. Imagine the spectacle. The intrigue begins on the horizon. Across the scorching sands of the Sahara, a caravan approaches. 60,000 people. 60,000. This was not just a caravan. It was an entire city choosing to stroll through the desert. 12,000 servants, dressed in the finest Persian silk, each wielding a staff made of pure gold. 80 camels, each hauling 300 pounds of gold dust. The rhythm of this procession was both majestic and daunting. Listen, when this golden train entered Cairo, People were left in awe. Mansa Musa was not greedy at all. Quite the opposite. He showered gold left and right. He built mosques in every city where he paused on Fridays. He handed out gold bars to the poor, traders, and officials. He bought souvenirs at prices that seemed outrageous. And then, a pause. Silence. Do you know what happened next? He distributed so much gold in Cairo, Medina, and Mecca that its value plummeted, simply depreciated. This was the first recorded inflation in history, triggered by a single individual. Egypt's economy was devastated for a decade. Imagine, gold became so abundant that you could not even buy a sack of grain for it. Wait, I almost forgot the most important detail. Mansa Musa was not just a wealthy man, he was a visionary. From his journey, he returned not only with experiences, but also with the finest architects, poets, and scholars of the Islamic world. He transformed Timbuktu into the intellectual capital of Africa. They built universities and gigantic libraries there. His empire became a place where books were valued more than that very gold he scattered across the desert. Listen, when he returned home, he learned about the crisis he had caused in Cairo. And do you know what he did? He began to buy back gold from local merchants at inflated prices to stabilize the situation. He was perhaps the only individual in history who personally managed the price of gold across an entire continent. Do you know what is the most ironic? On European maps of that time, Mansa Musa was depicted sitting on a throne, holding a massive golden orb in his hand. For Europe, he was a legend, a myth, almost a deity. But for his people, he was above all a man who proved, the true value of an empire is not the shining metal in chests, but the knowledge stored in the minds of its people. Well, did you feel the shine of these treasures? Sometimes it seems like money is everything. Yet later on, one realizes that it can accidentally break the world. Speaking of items that hold tremendous value yet are completely weightless, we have a story in our archive about a person who believed he could sell silence. Surprisingly enough, there were those willing to pay for it. This is story number 20, a secret treasure in the roots of a fallen oak. Have you ever pondered which item in your home is the most, shall we say, inconspicuous, yet carries an almost detective-like history? No, I'm not talking about the remote control that always seems to disappear. I'm referring to an ordinary pencil, that simple tool, a wooden stick with a gray core. We chew on it when we think or use it to jot down grocery lists. But imagine a time when people were willing to endure hard labor for a piece of this gray substance, while soldiers guarded it with loaded rifles. Let's transport ourselves to England in 1564, to the county of Cumbria in the Borrowdale Valley. It was night, and a terrible storm raged. You know, the kind of weather that makes it seem like the sky might split in two. The wind uprooted ancient oaks, and the rain turned roads into rivers. The following morning, a local shepherd, whose name history did not record, but let's call him Bill, went out to inspect his pastures and found a fallen tree. A massive oak lay on its side, its dark, wet roots exposed. Bill peered into the hole under the tree and saw something unusual. Stones, but not ordinary ones. They were soft, greasy to the touch, and remarkably, they smeared his hands with a thick, shiny black color. The shepherd assumed he had discovered coal and tried to light it. It wouldn't catch fire. Well, he thought, perhaps it's a medicine, but the sheep wouldn't eat it? So Bill simply took a piece of this black mud and marked his sheep. And lo and behold, the mark was clear, bright, and remained intact despite the rain. Thus, the world came to know about graphite. Listen, this was the only pure solid graphite deposit in the world. There was no second such deposit anywhere on the planet. Initially, people used it to brand livestock, but then, wait a minute, the intrigue deepened significantly. It turned out that this material was perfect for the linings of cannonballs. If you coated the mold with graphite, the projectile came out smooth and flew farther. Graphite instantly became the #1 strategic resource. Royal property. It was dubbed black lead, though there was no lead in it whatsoever. Mines were established in Borrowdale, but they were guarded as if they were extracting diamonds the size of fists. Soldiers patrolled the area day and night. To prevent theft, the mines operated for only a few weeks each year. Then they would flood with water so that no one could sneak in and steal even a crumb of black gold. The black market flourished. Smugglers risked their lives to sneak a piece of graphite in the lining of their cloaks. Its price on the London markets was astonishing. Do you know how pencils came into being? People started cutting graphite into thin sticks, but it made their hands terribly dirty. Then they began wrapping it in ropes and leather, and later they figured out how to place it in wooden cases. Thus, the very first writing instrument in history was born. Interestingly, for a long time, only England possessed the secret to producing true pencils. The French and Germans attempted to create something similar by mixing graphite powder with glue and sulfur, but it resulted in a poor outcome. The pencils scratched the paper and broke easily. English monopoly lasted for decades. Do you know what's most ironic? Today, we discard a pencil when it becomes too short, completely unaware that 400 years ago, such a stub could buy you a cow or land you in prison. So, have you looked at your pencil holder with a newfound curiosity? Sometimes the simplest things are the result of storms, fallen oaks, and strict state secrets. Speaking of secrets and things that literally change our world in a flash, we have a story in our archive about how one person decided they could defy gravity using only their imagination and a lot of silk. And no, this wasn't a magician, but rather someone who simply wanted to prove that the sky belongs to everyone. Story number 21. 6 dots that ignited light in eternal darkness. Have you ever tried reading in absolute darkness? Not when the screen of your phone offers some kind of glow, but when the darkness is thick like jelly. When your eyes are just ornaments that provide no benefit. We are accustomed to the idea that knowledge comes through light, through letters on paper, or pixels on a monitor. But imagine a boy who decided that light could be, let's say, felt with the tips of his fingers. He achieved this at an age when others were still learning to write in cursive. Let's journey back to the year 1812. France, a small village called Coupvray. In the workshop of a harness maker, known for crafting horse gear, a 3-year-old child named Louis is busy. Louis Braille. The air is filled with the scents of leather, wax, and metal. Louis's father momentarily distracted, an everyday occurrence, perhaps a customer walked in or he needed to take out the trash. In that moment, Louis took a sharp tool from the table, a stitching awl, heavy, shiny, and dangerous. He intended to do what his father does and pierce a piece of leather. And then there was a pause. Silence, broken only by a sudden sharp sound. His hand slipped, and the awl struck his eye. You see, medicine at that time was, let's put it frankly, rather lacking. Inflammation began. It spread to his other eye, and by the age of 5, little Louis was permanently blind. Imagine this world from a child's perspective. Yesterday there were vibrant colors and sunshine, and today only sounds and smells remain. But Louis didn't give up. He was an incredibly determined boy. He was sent to Paris, to a special school for blind children. And here's where it gets interesting. Do you know how they read there? It was quite an engineering nightmare. The paper was pressed from the other side, resulting in gigantic raised letters. One book weighed as much as a sack of potatoes. To read a single page, you had to run your hand over a massive surface for several minutes. It was slow, cumbersome, and utterly inconvenient. Louis felt there had to be another way. Then, the captain of the French army, Charles Barbier, arrived at the school. He brought with him his invention, the night alphabet. Soldiers utilized it to read orders in the trenches at night without starting a fire. It consisted of combinations of 12 dots punched into cardboard. Louis tried it out and realized that the idea was brilliant, but the execution was lacking. 12 dots were simply too many. The tip of a finger cannot cover them all at once, requiring hand movements that slowed down reading. So, at the age of 15, can you believe it, just 15? Louis took that very pricking awl, the tool that had deprived him of his sight, and began to carve his path to enlightenment. He simplified the system to just 6 dots, 3 in height and 2 in width. an ideal rectangle that perfectly matched the fingertip. Each combination represented a letter, a number, or a note. When he presented it to his teachers, of course, they responded with skepticism. What could a teenager possibly invent? His system was even attempted to be banned at school. The principal believed that blind children should read like normal people, not by some dots. Yet, the children began to pass secret notes to one another under their desks. They realized, this is freedom. This is the ability to write for ourselves. Louis didn't just give them the gift of reading, he gifted them writing as well. Louis Braille passed away at a young age, at 43. He never discovered that his system would become a global standard, that his name would be pronounced in every language on earth. You know what's most touching? In his hometown of Coupe, a monument now stands, and inscribed on it are the words, "He opened the doors of knowledge to those who were locked in darkness." So, when you see those small dots on elevator buttons or medicine packaging today, remember, these are not just bumps. They are echoes of that little boy with an awl who decided that darkness was not a sentence, but simply a problem to be solved. Well, did you feel how the tips of your fingers became a bit more sensitive? Sometimes, 6 dots are all it takes to change the fate of millions. Speaking of things that transform our world while remaining nearly unnoticed, we have a story in our archive about how one person decided he could build the most reliable bridge in the world using only ordinary threads and a great deal of patience. Story number 22. A city that wasn't on the map, but was seen by all. Do you enjoy movies? Not the modern ones where everything is created on green screens with the help of computers. I'm talking about that old Hollywood magic, where sets were built from wood, paper mache, and a belief in miracles when an entire world could fit into one studio. But imagine a scenario where a set designer had to build not a room or a street, but an entire residential block suspended in the air, not for an action movie, but to conceal a massive factory from view. Let's transport ourselves to the year 1944. Set in the American coast, envision the BEW Number D factory. It was a behemoth, a giant of 26 acres made of concrete, steel, and glass, housing 30,000 people inside. The population of a small town was continuously being monitored by airplanes, but there was one significant issue. From an aerial view, the factory sparkled in the sunlight like a massive target. It was far too conspicuous and overwhelmingly critical. Consequently, the government concluded that if relocating it wasn't an option, they needed to make it vanish instead. The solution? An illusion. Camouflage. Yet not just mere paint splatters, but a true masterpiece of engineering. This is where John Stewart Detley, a Hollywood set designer, came into play, a man who understood how to trick the eye. It was a brilliant scheme. Right on the factory's roof, an imitation of a town was constructed. This project was dubbed Wonderland. Just imagine it. Workers erected hundreds of tiny houses, but they weren't real homes. They stood merely about 4 feet high, just up to an adult's waist. Made of wooden frames with plywood walls, from 1,000 meters above, they appeared to be a cozy suburban area. Detley had thought of everything. He paved streets with painted asphalt and planted thousands of trees. Can you guess what they were made of? Wire and painted burlap. The bushes were crafted from old pillow stuffing. To bring everything to life, artists added details, painted shadows, tiny fences, and even fake cars parked near the houses. Ironically, people at the factory continued their work as usual. Thousands of tons of steel moved beneath the feet of the residents of this toy town, while above, the wind blew across the roof, rustling the burlap, which honestly made it look both eerie and beautiful at the same time. Occasionally, factory employees would venture up to the roof during their lunch breaks. Picture this scene. Adult men and women strolling through streets where the houses reached their shoulders, and the trees were low enough to step over. They felt like Gulliver and Lilliput. They walked on lawns that were actually nets stretched over ventilation shafts. But the magic worked. Pilots flying overhead for training purposes reported, "No factory detected, just a quiet residential area." Want to know the funniest part? After the war, this ghost town wasn't immediately demolished. It remained there for several more years. Residents of the real town sometimes glanced upward, seeing some peculiar tranquil fairy tale hovering over the industrial zone. Eventually, the plywood was taken down and the burlap was discarded. However, this story remained as a testament to a time when Hollywood fantasy and cold calculation combined to create the largest set decoration in human history. So, have you started viewing the roofs of your houses in a different light? Sometimes, what appears to be solid ground is merely thin plywood above an abyss of ideas. Speaking of entities that alter reality while remaining almost weightless, we have a story in our archives about how one person believed they could halt an entire army using just sun catchers. And no, this wasn't a myth. It was a genuine scientific calculation that set the sea ablaze. Story number 23. The island where time decided to turn back. Have you ever felt like life is moving too quickly? When days blend into one monotonous stretch, your phone buzzes incessantly with notifications, and you barely notice the leaves unfurling on the trees. We're always rushing somewhere. But imagine a place where people have decided enough is enough, where time itself is not a ruler by which we measure productivity, but rather, let's say, a suggestion. Let's travel to northern Norway, to a remote place called Samoa Island. This is literally the edge of the world. However, it has one unique astronomical feature. From the 18th of May until the 26th of July, for 69 days, the sun never sets there. Can you believe it? 0 hours of darkness. Midnight looks just like noon. Golden light bathes the cliffs, oceans, and the quaint fishing cottages. And here's where it gets really fascinating. The inhabitants of the island, who have lived there for generations, have come to a simple realization. If there's no night, then why do we need clocks? Picture this lifestyle. At 2 in the morning, according to standard time, you can see children playing football on the school field. At 3 in the morning, someone might start painting their fence or repairing their boat. Shops open when the owner gets out of bed. Neighbors drop in for coffee whenever they feel like it, without considering the time. This sounds like paradise for those who are always late. In 2019, the residents of Samoa officially petitioned the government to abolish time on their island altogether, making it the first time-free zone in the world. When you cross the bridge to the island, you see not just a sign, but the entire bridge adorned with clocks. People take off their wristwatches and leave them on the railings, symbolizing that they are no longer needed there. It looks like a contemporary artist's installation, but for the locals, it's a statement of freedom. We want to reclaim the right to be human beings, not cogs in a machine, they say. If I want to fish at 4 in the morning, I'll go fishing. If I want to sleep until noon, I'll sleep. Naturally, skeptics and officials are pulling their hair out. What about transportation schedules, schools, the post? But the islanders just smile. They've proven that without deadlines, stress levels drop to 0. People become kinder. They engage in meaningful conversations. Life fills with purpose rather than numbers. You know what's the funniest part? This idea has spread around the globe. Tourists have begun flocking to Samoa simply to forget what day of the week it is for a few days, just to be. By the way, there's an unwritten rule on the island. If you ask a local what time it is, they'll likely look at the sun, shrug, and reply, "It's time to live, my friend. Time to just live." So, are you tempted to toss your alarm clock out the window? Sometimes we need to escape to a small, cold island to realize that we've constructed our own cages out of seconds and minutes. Speaking of people who know how to create their own worlds within reality, in our archive, there exists a tale about a man who believed he could construct his dream castle without using a single nail or a drop of cement, relying solely on his own memory of a place that had never existed. This is story number 24. A silk pouch that was not meant to get wet. Have you noticed that we often make significant discoveries simply because we, let's say, don't enjoy reading instructions, or perhaps we interpret what we see too literally? We are creatures of habit, yet sometimes breaking from routine creates an entire industry. Picture your morning. A cup, boiling water, and a small paper bag with a label. It seems so simple, But that little bag came into existence because, one day in New York, a merchant decided to save money on tin cans. Let us travel to 1908, New York. The clatter of the first streetcars, the smell of coal, and the endless hustle of a port city. In that city lived a gentleman named Thomas Sullivan. He was a tea merchant. Back then, tea was serious business. It was sold in large, heavy tin cans. It was expensive and cumbersome. If you wanted to send a customer just a sample to evaluate a new blend, it would cost a fortune in packing materials. Thomas sat in his shop, looking at bills, and thought, there must be a simpler way. And then an idea sparked. He ordered hundreds of small bags made from the finest expensive Chinese silk. You know, that delicate, semi-transparent fabric. He filled them with scoops of premium tea, tied them with golden thread, and sent them to his best clients. Thomas envisioned that customers would open the pouch, pour the contents into a teapot, and, well, enjoy the aroma. The silk was merely an elegant packaging, nothing more. But hold on, people are remarkable beings. Sullivan's clients received these bags. They looked at them. Beautiful? Yes, certainly convenient. And they thought to themselves, why should we open it? They simply took the silk cocoon and tossed it whole into the boiling water. Listen, this was a culinary revolution that even the creator himself was unaware of. A week later, enthusiastic letters began pouring in about Thomas. Mr. Sullivan, this is brilliant. No leaves stuck in teeth, no hassle with strainers. Send more. At first, Thomas didn't even understand what they were talking about. What leaves? What strainer? But when he realized that his customers were brewing the expensive silk along with the tea, he didn't try to change their minds. He understood that he had just inadvertently invented convenience. But you know what is the most ironic part? That first tea bag was too perfect. The silk was too thick. It poorly allowed the flavor to seep through. Thomas began to experiment. He tried gauze, but it imparted a taste. He tested various types of fabric. Ultimately, after years, another inventor figured out how to use a special paper made from manila hemp fibers, the very one we use today. Interestingly, initially, true tea connoisseurs wrinkled their noses at this. They called it lazy man's tea. They claimed the bag killed the soul of the beverage, but life's pace quickened. People no longer wanted to wait 10 minutes for the brew to settle at the bottom. They craved instant magic. Nowadays, thousands of tea bags are brewed every second, and each time you pull it out by its string, remember, it all began with one frugal merchant who simply didn't want to pay for extra tin cans. Well, can you feel how sometimes mistakes in using things lead to progress? Sometimes it's enough just not to open a package to unlock a new chapter in history. Speaking of items that hold immense power while remaining almost weightless, we have a story in our archives about a man who decided he could create the most reliable way to transmit information using only ordinary mirrors and sunlight. And this wasn't just a game. It saved lives when the ground felt like it was slipping away. Story number 25. The labyrinth from which no one wanted to leave without bread. Tell me, do you enjoy grocery shopping? Honestly, for some it's like meditation, while for others it's a heavy chore. But imagine that process 100 years ago. 1916. You walk into a store. There are no carts, no shelves from which you can simply pick things up. Between you and your food stands a huge, often not so polite counter, and behind it stands a shopkeeper. You hand him a list, and he slowly, very slowly, makes his way to the shelves, retrieves a bag of flour, weighs some sugar, and wraps up cheese. If there are 3 or 4 people in front of you, you could spend half your life in that line. It was slow, it was expensive, and frankly, it was incredibly dull. But in the city of Memphis, there lived a man named Clarence Saunders who decided it was all complete nonsense. Picture the morning of September 11th of that very year, when Clarence opened a store with an unusual name, Piggly Wiggly. People approached the doors, peeked inside, and froze. There was no counter at all. Instead, there was a turnstile. You know, a revolving thing like in the subway, but made of wood. You pass through it and enter a real maze. The shelves were arranged in such a way that you couldn't just grab a loaf of bread and run away. You had to walk past every item, past cans, past spices, past fresh vegetables. And most importantly, you could touch everything. For the people of that time, it was shocking, a pure cultural explosion. How could I pick up a can myself? What if I drop it? What if I change my mind? But Clarence had anticipated everything. He understood psychology. If a person holds an item in their hands, the likelihood of them buying it increases exponentially. The rhythm of shopping was forever changed. Listen, he invented things that seem as natural to us today as breathing, like price tags. Prior to Saunders, there were no prices on items. You would ask the seller, and he could say any amount, looking at your shoes or hat. Clarence established fixed prices. He introduced shopping baskets. He even made cashiers wear uniforms to give the store a clean and professional look. But you know what's the kindest part of this story? Clarence didn't just want to make a profit, he wanted to make food more affordable. By removing the army of clerks, he was able to reduce prices to a level where ordinary working-class families could finally afford delicacies. This was democracy in its purest form, packaged in a tin can. Incidentally, when he opened his first store, he threw a genuine celebration: music, flowers, and treats. He aimed to transform the grocery shopping experience from a chore into an adventure, and he succeeded. Within a few years, thousands of such labyrinthine stores operated across America. Do you know what's the most ironic part? The name, Piggly Wiggly. When Clarence was asked why he chose that name for his empire, he would usually shrug and say, "So you would ask me about it? A marketing genius. What can I say?" So, are you heading to the store for milk today? Remember, every time you push your cart down the aisles, you're following a path once envisioned by a very daring fellow from Tennessee who believed that the shopper should be in charge of their own experience. Sometimes, all it takes is removing one barrier to open up a whole new world. Speaking of seemingly endless pathways, we have a story in our archives about a man who thought he could build the longest and most unique bridge in the world using only sunlight and his dreams. This bridge didn't connect shores, it connected centuries. Story number 26, The Stones That Move by Themselves. Listen, have you ever felt like someone was behind you? You turn around, but there's no one there, just silence and emptiness. Imagine a place where this feeling becomes tangible, a place where the earth itself seems to play with you. We often think of stones as symbols of immobility, solid and static. However, in a corner of our planet, the stones behave as if they have plans for the evening, which include long strolls. Let's move to the United States, California, in Death Valley. The name sounds frightening, right? But it's actually incredibly beautiful. There's a place there, a dry lake called Racetrack Playa. Its perfectly flat, cracked surface glistens from the heat, and the clay is as hard as concrete. The silence is so profound that you can hear your blood pulsing in your ears. Now picture this. In the midst of this emptiness lie stones, ordinary dolomite boulders. Some weigh as much as a decent microwave, while others weigh nearly 300 kilograms, about the weight of a grown adult. And behind each of them stretches a trail, a long, clear groove in the hard clay, extending for dozens, even hundreds of meters. The trails twist, turn at right angles, run parallel, or suddenly diverge in different directions. It looks as though the stones had a race here while no one was watching. Here's the twist. For nearly 100 years, no one, I emphasize, no one, has seen them move. People propose the most outlandish theories: magnetic fields, pranks, aliens. Some even believe that the stones possess some form of rudimentary consciousness. Scientists erected barriers around the stones, but the stones moved through them without touching the mesh, or simply ignored the obstacles altogether. A genuine scientific impasse had been reached. The rhythm of this prolonged illusion began to irritate researchers, and so in 2014, imagine, just recently in the grand scheme of history, a group of scientists decided to take drastic measures. They brought their own stones, equipped with GPS sensors, to the lake and set up time-lapse cameras. They waited for months. Silence. Heat. Nothing was happening. And then? No, wait. The revelation didn't come from the heat, but from the cold. In winter, a rare rain fell on the lake. A thin layer of water covered the clay, and at night, frost set in. The scientists witnessed something remarkable. The water froze, transforming into gigantic yet extremely thin sheets of ice resembling window panes. During the day, the sun started to warm, causing the ice to crack, and a gentle breeze, a mere light breeze, began to push these ice fields. Picture this physics. A vast expanse of ice has immense sail-like properties. The ice presses against the stone. Beneath the stone lies slippery, softened clay. A boulder weighing 300 kilograms begins to slowly crawl along the bottom at a rate of several centimeters per second. It leaves a groove that will solidify once the water evaporates. This was disappointingly simple, yet simultaneously brilliant. Nature created a perfect mechanism that only worked under 1,000 specific conditions. Rain is needed, frost is necessary, the ice must be of a particular thickness, and sunlight is required. If any one factor is missing, the stones will remain still. Do you know what's amusing? Even after the secret was unveiled, people still flock to Racetrack Playa because knowing how it works and witnessing it firsthand are two entirely different experiences. There, you still feel that the world is far more complex and fickle than we imagine. But what if you felt that the earth beneath your feet could be a bit less reliable than you thought? Sometimes, even stones find a way to set off on a journey if they truly wish. By the way, speaking of things that can change their form and astonish us, we have a tale in our archives about how one very peculiar discovery in an ordinary garage led to an oversight that caused people to reevaluate the entire history of cooking. And it wasn't related to recipes. It was about how we perceive energy itself. Story number 27. A garden that never wilts and fears no winter. So, do you enjoy flowers? Not just enough to purchase a bouquet from a stand at the subway, but to stand awestruck before a petal, examining every delicate vein, every speck of pollen on the stamen. We are accustomed to nature's beauty being fleeting. It blooms in the morning and wilts by evening. That's the law. But imagine a place where spring has frozen forever, and not in the form of photographs or herbariums that over time decay into gray dust, but as glass, clear, transparent, and seemingly alive. Let's travel back to 1886, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University. Back then, botany professors struggled. I mean, really, how can you teach students when it's winter outside and you need to demonstrate the anatomy of a rare orchid? You either have dry, yellowing specimens in folders or clumsy wax models that melt in the sun and resemble half-melted ice cream. Accuracy? None. Aesthetics? Even less. And that's when Professor George Lincoln Goodale heard about the astonishing artisans from Bohemia, Leopold Rudolf Blaschka, the father and son duo. To be honest, they weren't scientists. They were hereditary glassblowers. You know, the kind who can fashion glass into anything from a wine glass to the most intricate optical lenses. But they possessed a fervent passion. They adored the ocean. They began to craft marine creatures from glass, jellyfish, sea anemones, mollusks. Their creations were so precise that biologists were left in awe. Goodale thought, I need them to create a garden for us. Picture that rhythm of life, a small village near Dresden, a smoky workshop. The father and son sit across from each other. In between them, only the flame of a torch and heaps of glass tubing. They worked together, without assistants, without apprentices. Silence, only the hissing of fire. They didn't merely blow glass. No, wait. They invented something greater. They utilized lamp-working techniques, heating colored glass, pulling it into threads finer than human hair, and tinting it from within with metallic oxides. They created delicate fibers on stems, pollen, signs of insect bites on leaves. If a leaf needed to show signs of rust from fungus, they crafted that rust from glass. You see, this was meticulous work. For 50 years, they labored solely for Harvard. The result? 3,000 models, over 800 species of plants. When you step into that museum hall, your head spins. You see a maple leaf that appears red from the chill of autumn. You see a cactus with spines that seem prickly enough to stab you. And all of it is glass, brittle, eternal, perfect. By the way, there was one mystery. Scientists spent decades trying to decipher how they achieved such realism. Rumors circulated about secret glues, about magical additives. But when chemical analysis was finally conducted at the end of the 20th century, it turned out there were no secrets. Just pure craftsmanship and endless patience. You know what's most astonishing? When Rudolf, the last of the dynasty, completed his work, the secret of their craft vanished with him. No one has been able to replicate it. Today we have lasers, printers, nanotechnology, but no one can create a glass flower that would entice a bee to land on it. Well, do you feel the fragility of this world? Sometimes the hardest things are born from fire and the most fragile material in existence. The key is to have enough patience to perceive beauty in every detail. Speaking of things that require meticulous precision and nerves of steel, our archive holds a story about how a rather peculiar discovery in an ordinary basement led to the creation of the most secure place on the planet. And it wasn't a government bunker. It was a place where what is more valuable than any gold was kept. Story number 28. An icy ark for those who wish to feed the future. By the way, have you ever pondered what we would do if everything goes awry? Not in the sense of forgetting your email password or missing a bus, but in terms of our entire civilization. We have become so accustomed to the idea that food is always available in stores, apples year-round, bread every morning. This notion seems unshakable. But imagine a place designed specifically to ensure that this order is never disrupted, even in the event of complete chaos on the planet. Let's transport ourselves to the island of Spitsbergen, Norway, 1,100 kilometers from the North Pole. Envision this landscape: permafrost, barren rocks shrouded in snow, the darkness of the polar night sliced only by the northern lights. And right in the mountainside, you see something peculiar: a concrete portal glowing with an otherworldly turquoise light. It resembles the entrance to a secret supervillain's lair from a movie. Yet inside, there are no rockets or lasers, only seeds. This is the global seed vault, known as the Doomsday Vault. Listen closely. This is the most secure location on the planet. However, the intrigue lies in the fact that its protection comes not just from thick walls, but from nature itself. The seed chamber is situated 120 meters deep within the rock. Why so deep? So that, even if all the electricity in the world fails, the permafrost will continue to function as a gigantic natural refrigerator. The rhythm of this place is silence and cold, maintaining a constant temperature of -18 degrees Celsius. Inside, metal shelves hold millions of specimens: rice from China, corn from Mexico, wheat from Russia. Nearly all plants we consume are represented here as duplicates. It's like a backup of your life, only on a scale for all of humanity. If a disaster strikes a nation, be it drought, flooding, or a simple agricultural misstep, they can submit a request and Spitsbergen will return their heritage. Interestingly, there was an incident that demonstrated this is not merely an expensive toy for scientists. Once, due to conflict in Syria, the local seed bank became inaccessible. People lost access to unique plant varieties that had grown there for thousands of years, and for the first time in history, the Doomsday Vault opened its doors to provide samples. Specimens were sent back to Lebanon and Morocco, allowing scientists to restore the crops. It worked, you see. The Ark preserved part of our shared past so we could have a future. But do you know what's most touching about this? In Spitsbergen, there is no politics. Boxes from countries that may not even converse in the regular world lie side by side. Inside the mountain, they are merely neighbors, just people wanting their children to know the taste of bread. The entrance to the vault is adorned with a mirrored glass installation that reflects polar light during the day and glows at night. It stands as a beacon, symbolizing that even in the coldest and most desolate places, we can safeguard what is truly precious to us. So, do you feel a bit more at ease about tomorrow? Sometimes, the most significant treasures are not gold bullion, but tiny seeds hidden deep within the Arctic ice. Speaking of things that require incredible perseverance and the ability to keep secrets, we have a tale in our archives about a man who decided he could deceive an entire army using only silence and his skill of vanishing in plain sight. And it wasn't a ghost. It was simply an ordinary person who was very keen on not being discovered. Story number 29. The city that packed its bags and moved to a new location. Tell me, have you ever relocated? You know, that chaos. Boxes everywhere, tape that always seems to stick where it shouldn't, and that old sofa that refuses to fit in the elevator. We usually spend a week afterward searching for our favorite mug. Now, imagine having to move not just furniture, but your entire city, complete with houses, hospitals, hotels, and even the trees in the parks. Sounds like the ridiculous idea of a mad architect, right? But in the state of Minnesota, this became a reality 100 years ago. Let's travel back to 1918. The city of Hibbing. Back then, this place was known as the iron capital of the world. The people there were tough and hardworking. And, as it turned out, they lived on a genuine treasure. Right beneath the foundations of their homes, under schoolyards, and beneath the main street lay a massive vein of iron ore, the richest in history. The mining company took a look at this, calculated the profits, and, well, you can guess what happened next. They approached the residents and said, "Folks, we have two pieces of news for you. The bad news is there's a lot of iron under your basements, and we need to extract it. The good news is we're not demolishing your city. We're just going to move it." Listen, this was an engineering adventure of biblical proportions. Actually, wait, it was even more impressive. The challenge was figuring out how to shift a brick building weighing 1,000 tons. In 1919, the Great Relocation began. Picture the scene. Engineers were digging out the foundations. They placed enormous steel beams under the houses. Then, they set the buildings on thousands of wooden rollers and tracked tractors. The city literally rolled away. The massive colonial hotel, longer than 50 meters, was cut into two pieces, loaded onto platforms, and slowly towed over hills to a new location 2 miles away from the old one. People stood along the roads, believing their eyes. Imagine walking to the store for bread and your local library wobbles past you. But do you know what's most astonishing? Life in Hibbing didn't stop. Workers managed to connect temporary hoses for water and electrical wires to the moving houses. It's said that in some offices, people continued to type documents and sip coffee while their building slowly crawled through the mud towards the new area. One woman even managed to bake a pie while her kitchen was on the move. Within 3 years, by 1921, 185 buildings were relocated without a single major damage. No panic. Just one city decided it was too good to dismantle. By the way, in its new spot, Hibbing became even more beautiful. The company built modern roads, a new school that resembled a palace, and a splendid park. People received more comfortable housing, and the company gained access to the ore. A rare case where everyone benefited. Today, a massive quarry occupies the site of Old Hibbing. But if you visit the new city, the locals will surely show you the traveling houses, those same beings that once knew how to walk. So, have you realized that your moving troubles are nothing more than child's play? Sometimes, to preserve what you cherish, you need to be flexible rather than stubborn and just shift a little. Speaking of things that seem eternal yet can vanish in an instant, our archive holds the final narrative of how one individual thought he could deceive nature itself by creating something that would live forever without requiring food, water, or even sunlight. This is the tale of the most extraordinary living creature the world has ever seen. Story number 30. The man who named the celestial spirits. Have you ever attempted to catch fog or describe in words the shape of smoke rising from a fire? It's simply impossible. This is chaos, pure flux. Now, imagine the sky. It's always above us, vast and perpetually changing. For the people of the past, clouds were merely clouds, phantoms that appeared and disappeared. No one believed they could be categorized. How can one assign a name to something that will morph into something entirely different in 5 seconds? Let's travel back to the year 1802. London, a dusty attic in one of the pharmacies. Here resides a young man named Luke Howard. Frankly speaking, he is an ordinary pharmacist. He mixes powders, weighs ointments, and writes prescriptions for coughs. However, his soul has always lived beyond the glass of the window. Since childhood, Luke has been captivated by the sky. He kept weather diaries while other children played soldiers. He sketched sunsets when his peers were studying Latin. One day, Luke realized that the sky is not chaos. It has its own language, its own system. But to grasp it, one must stop viewing clouds as random splotches. Imagine that moment, the soft glow of a candle. Luke sits at his desk, surrounded by his drawings. He understands that clouds are akin to living beings. They are born, grow, and vanish according to specific rules. He resolves to utilize Latin, that long-dead language, to bring the sky to life. He identifies 3 primary categories. The first is cirrus, the wispy clouds. Polotini signifies curl or lock, those delicate icy threads high up. The second is cumulus, translating to heap or pile, those fluffy mountains of cotton candy that we love to draw as children. And the third is stratus, a layered blanket, a gray, uniform layer that covers the entire sky. This was brilliantly simple. In December of the same year, when Luke Howard presented his findings to a small philosophical society, silence fell over the room. People gazed at him as though he had just tamed the wild ocean. He combined these terms to create cumulonimbus, those towering storm clouds. He provided us with a vocabulary with which we began to understand the sky. The rhythm of science changed in an instant. The great poet and thinker Goethe was so impressed that he dedicated a cycle of poems to Luke Howard, calling him the man who tamed the clouds. Thanks to the humble pharmacist, meteorology transformed from a game of coffee grounds into a genuine science. But do you know what is the most touching part? Luke Govart chose to continue working at his pharmacy. He was not in search of fame, nor did he desire accolades. It was enough for him that now, when stepping outside and looking up, people saw not just white spots. They observed cirrus clouds. They recognized stratus layers. They began to notice beauty in places where they once only perceived uncertainty. Well, our journey through the archives has come to a close. But do you know what the secret is? The archives are truly infinite. Every day someone makes a small discovery, someone performs a kind act, and someone simply looks up at the sky for the first time in a long while. Cherish that sense of wonder. It is the most valuable thing we possess. And the next time you see a fluffy cumulus cloud in the sky, just smile and remember the humble pharmacist from London who gave us that name. Thank you for joining us in this series. The world is brimming with marvels. We just need to learn how to notice them. Until we meet again in other stories, look out the window. There lies a whole universe.